Hey Deckers, today we're having a look at The Witcher 3 on previous generation and next generation, with previous generation here on the left, and we've also got the next gen versions on the right. The reason we have the 4 here is because on the top we have the medium preset and on the bottom we have the high preset. So going to be testing previous versus next gen on medium and high here. So have a look at the differences. Time of day was a bit of an issue here, so we will head inside a bit. And the first major difference here, which you'll see from the previous gen to the next gen, is the water quality. Water in the previous gen was just a blue liquid, whereas in the next gen version we have much more realistic water, although the colour is a little bit off-putting. Inside we have massive new lighting effects, and it's very difficult to tell exactly the differences here, especially in combat and moving around. On both medium and high settings, there's a lot of light and shadow differences, but the main differences you're going to see here is in the frames per second. Especially when the lights are going off, it's very difficult to see anything at all. But you'll see consistently here that the next gen version is around 5 to 10 frames per second below the frames per second of the previous gen. As we freeze, you'll really see the difference in the lighting effect on the next gen versions. As you can see here, as we go into the previous gen medium settings, the character almost looks like he's been cut out and the background doesn't look quite real here with those lighting effects. As we go to the next gen version, we see those lighting effects and shadows much more realistic, apart from that frames per second is obviously a bit lower. And as we go into the high version on the previous gen still looks very good here, and we do start to see those shadows. But on the high version of the next gen, it's much more realistic, and for some reason every time I freeze frame this, it's a little bit of a blurry image, but when it's in motion and the video is playing, it's much clearer. As we see them all together, it's a lot more difficult to tell those apart on the small images. So let's go into a lighter area. In the cutscenes, we start to see much more detail changes between previous and next gen. High and medium settings also has quite a few differences. You can see the massive lighting effect differences with the lighting and shadow between just the medium and high settings overall. But the big thing I really noticed between the previous gen and next gen is that there always seems to be, when the sun is out, a very yellow tint to the picture. This has always been the case for me when I've been testing out between previous and next gen. And even between the medium and the high settings, you really notice that. So you can really see the difference in the coloration there, just on the light alone. And if we put them side by side, you can really see that. So it really does make quite an impact to the overall image. On high, as I said, we get that coloration difference as well, but we also get the massive lighting and shadow differences overall. The high version of the graphics on the previous gen do look very good, apart from that yellow tinge. But the next gen just has that tweak of the way the light and the shadows work, and it just brings a bit of extra quality to the overall image. But there are instances that the previous gen high does still look a bit better in my book, and the next gen does seem to carry a little bit more blurriness overall. One thing I really struggle with is hair in this game. Just in general, the hair is always a little bit iffy, but in the next gen version, especially the hair on their head, does always seem to look a little bit off. You can see here, especially on the previous gen high version, and you'll see this as we go side by side a bit more, but the next gen version of the hair always just seems to be a little bit blurry. The previous gen versions do tend to look a little bit stringy here and there, but I do think it still looks a little bit better. But for me, the lighting and shadow in the next gen versions do really just bring the characters to life, and does make it look a little bit more realistic, apart from the fact that their hair always seems to be moving. I've never quite understood that, even when they're indoors. As we go into some kind of night gameplay here with Ciri, we really start to see some of those lighting and shadow effects starting to take effect. And one of the other things is, even on the default camera setting, you'll see that the next gen version is still slightly more zoomed in than the previous gen version. I still prefer going into the close version of the cameras, but for the previous version that's not an option, so I do have them all at the default. So as we come into some quick motion melee with the previous gen version here, we'll start to see some of these effects taking place. But one thing you'll notice, especially on the medium preset, it does hold between 50 and 60 frames per second quite comfortably, most of the time staying up in that higher end towards 60, but it does still dip down. As we come into the next gen medium settings, again we see those lighting effects and just a bit more effects overall on the weapons and moving around. But we do get a huge dip in that frames per second, where we're now between the 40 and 50 range rather than 50 and 60. As we come to the high setting for the previous gen, we get a huge dip in the overall kind of gamma quality, and just the dark areas just become really dark, and there is no major balance between the light and dark areas. And as you'll see in one of the freeze frames coming up, the balance between the light and dark is really odd in the previous gen version. As we come to the next gen high, we've got a much better balance of that light and dark overall, and the colors and the effects here are extremely good. However, we are dipping now down into the low 30s, whereas on the previous gen version it was more between 40 and 50. So as we bring them all together then, again in one of these cutscene sections, one of the things that I didn't notice until I got to this point is that in the next gen version the characters blink, whereas in the previous gen version that doesn't seem to happen. So you'll see that both the medium and high presets, the characters do blink. So in one of the freeze frames here, the character's eyes are closed. And this is one of the points where I think the previous gen high version actually looks incredibly good here. On the medium settings, again, we carry a little bit of blurriness on the freeze frame on the next gen version, and it's really difficult to see the differences here between previous gen and next gen, apart from a bit of that blur and slightly more detail on the character model themselves, especially around the clothes. Paying more attention to that really brings to light some of the next gen version changes. On the high detail, again, I think the previous gen version here looks a bit clearer, but look at the difference in the coloration and shadowing of the clothes on the next gen high version here, especially around their right arm, where it should be a bit more muddy on the other characters. Something else I noticed while I was doing this is that there does seem to be a bit of extra lag on the next gen versions, that they take a little bit longer to load in some of those cutscenes, but it's only very minor. As we bring them all together then for a bit of that combat, now you can see those frames per second a little bit more clearly, with both the previous gen versions holding over 10 frames per second higher than the next gen version, even on the medium here. And as we bring them side by side on the medium settings, we'll again see some of those changes. The water is definitely the biggest difference overall here, all throughout the game, and the coloration balance between the light and dark areas is much better on the next gen version, but that frames per second hit is just a little bit hard to swallow. And there does seem to be generally a little bit more blurriness on the next gen version, which is more obvious when we're putting it side by side here, but in game it just looks pretty good on the deck screen, and for some reason you don't really notice that blur at all. As we come on to the high settings, we see again that watercolor difference overall much more clearly, and also the coloration difference between the light and dark areas, but it's very hard to tell any of the other differences in the darker areas, especially in the fast combat, where that frames per second difference just becomes a bit more obvious. Overall, the next gen version does just look better during the gameplay. However, the frames per second drop has been very hard to swallow by a lot of people. Medium settings actually felt a lot better for me on the next gen version than the high does, even capped at 30 on the high settings. It does look really good, but having the bit of extra frames per second and the fluidity on medium settings just striked a nice balance. Previously, I have recommended the 30 frames per second locked on modified high settings, but after playing through this on both the previous and next gen versions, I think I'd change this to just the default medium preset on next gen, and being able to just have a much better range of 40 to 60 frames per second with a good balance of the previous and next gen. Let us know in the comments below which version you like the best here and which you have been playing on The Witcher 3. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.